I worked 3 years on the night trauma floor of the Vesalius Institute before I found out the bruise on the side of my neck was not a bruise. I was 25, and Omega, a night shift trauma nurse, and the woman who had put the mark there 4 months earlier, in the red dark of a mass casualty night, with both of us elbow deep in a stranger's chest, and neither of us saying a word about it afterward, was the chief of surgery, Dr. Vivienne Roche. She was 38. She was an alpha. The residents called her the frost surgeon, behind her back, and sometimes, when they were very tired and very frightened, to her face. And she did not correct them either way. She ran the trauma service and the surgical board, and in every way that mattered, the entire institution, from a glass office on the 7th floor that looked down through the atrium onto the marble lobby, where the founders' names were cut into the floor in brass.
Welcome, everyone! Don't forget to subscribe to the channel!
I had spoken perhaps 40 sentences to her in 3 years. 38 of them had been clinical. 2 of them had been the 2 I said on the mass casualty night, when she looked up at me across the table at 4 in the morning and asked me a question no attending had ever asked a night nurse. And I answered it honestly, the way you answer honestly when your hands are inside a dying man, and your body has decided, before your mouth, that you will not lie to this person again, as long as you live. I'm going to tell you about the morning the whole surgical floor stopped to watch Dr. Roche cancel a full day of elective operations and sit down on the edge of a bed in the private ward and not get up. But I have to back up first, because the sitting down is not the part that mattered. The mattering had already happened 4 months before, in Trauma Bay 2. In a smell of cold iron and bergamot, I had spent 4 months telling myself, I had imagined. If you want to hear the uncensored, too hot for YouTube version of this story, the one I cannot tell here, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. Let me back up to the beginning of me, because the beginning of me is the only thing that explains why I let a bond mark sit on my neck for 4 months and called it a bruise. I was born in a mill town in the north, the kind of town that had one good year in 1961 and has been quietly apologizing for it ever since. My mother was an Omega who cleaned the offices of the men who had closed the mill. My father was a Beta who drove a delivery route, and then, when I was 9, drove it to a different town and did not come back. My mother raised me and my 2 younger brothers on the office cleaning, and on the small, fierce theology of not being a burden. She taught me to be useful before she taught me to read. She taught me that an Omega's safety is the quiet she keeps, that the worst thing a body like ours can do is take up room, raise its voice, ask to be looked at. She died when I was 19, of the thing that kills tired women in mill towns, which is everything at once and nothing in particular. And I took the 2 boys and the small life insurance, and I did the only thing the careers officer had ever said an Omega like me could be good at, which paid and which kept its head down and which was always, always needed. I trained as a nurse. Let me tell you about my brothers, because they are the reason I was the nurse who never said no. And you cannot understand the next part without understanding that there was a reason, that the keeping small was not weakness, that it was for 9 years the most load-bearing thing in 3 people's lives. When our mother died, I was 19, and the boys were 14 and 11. There was a social worker who used the word care, by which she meant the boys would be taken into the system and sent to separate places, because that is what the system does with a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old whose mother has died and whose father drives a route in a different town. And I sat in a small municipal office with carpet the color of a bruise, and I told that woman that I would be taking my brothers, that I was 19 and a trainee nurse with a bed sit and 40 hours a week of agency shifts, and she told me, not unkindly, all the reasons that was not possible. And I told her, in the only voice my mother had ever taught me, the quiet, flat voice of an Omega who has decided something and will not be moved, that it was going to be possible, and that she could either help me make it possible or stand out of the way while I did it without her. I got my brothers. I do not entirely know how. I worked nights so I could be home in the afternoons. I took the heavy suppressants partly so the agencies would book me without the questions they ask an unbonded Omega, and partly because there was no room in that bedsit, in those years, for my own body to want anything. There was room for a 14-year-old's grief and an 11-year-old's nightmares, and the rent and the rota, and nothing else. And a body that wants things in a life with no room for wanting is just another mouth. And I had enough mouths. I made myself into a pair of hands attached to as little woman as I could manage. And I want to be clear that this saved 3 lives. That the younger boy is a teacher now, and the older one drives long haul and is gentle with his own children, in a way our father never was. And that I did that, the keeping small did that. And so, when Vivienne Roche said to me on the 7th night, "You took the only safe shape they offered you, and you got so good at it that no one ever made you be anything else," she was right. But she was only half right, because the safe shape was not only a cage, it was also a raft. It carried 3 people to shore. The trouble with a raft is that once you are on the shore, you are still somehow holding it over your head, still walking as though the weight is there. And it took an alpha sitting in a chair with her hands flat on her knees, refusing to cross a room, to make me understand that I could, finally, after 19 years, put the raft down. I was good at it. I want to say that plainly, because the quiet ones never say it, and someone should. I was very good at it. I had the thing they cannot teach, the thing the textbooks call clinical presence, and the old charge nurses call having hands, the ability to walk into a room where a body is failing and slow the whole room down by being in it. I could find a vein no one else could find. I could hold a frightened person still with the flat of my palm and the level of my voice. I could stand in the red middle of a trauma resuscitation, where 6 people are shouting over a 7th who is dying, and be the one still point the team turned to without knowing they were turning. I took suppressants every morning, the strong kind, the kind that flatten an omega's scent to almost nothing, because a trauma floor is no place to smell like orange groves, and a night nurse who reads as omega gets handled differently, and I had decided at 19 that I would never be handled. I wore my hair up. I wore the scrubs a size loose. I made myself into a good pair of hands attached to as little woman as I could manage, and for 3 years it worked. And nobody at the Vesalius Institute, where the surgeons are gods and the night nurses are weather, knew my scent or my heat status or my first name, unless they read it off the badge clipped at my hip, which said N. Wilder, RN, trauma, and which is the only name most of them ever used, if they used one at all. The Vesalius Institute is not a hospital the way the place I trained was a hospital. The Vesalius is 200 years old. It was founded by a guild of anatomists in a city that has had the same families running the same institutions for longer than my country has existed, and it has a marble atrium and a chapel and a library of surgical atlases that scholars fly across the world to touch. And it takes the cases no one else will take. The impossible chests, the ruined spines, the children other hospitals have already sent home to die. It is also, underneath the marble, a trauma center for the worst quarter of a hard old city. And the 2 things live in the same building. The gala in the atrium on the ground floor and the knife wounds coming through the ambulance bay in the basement. The founders' names in brass and the blood on the night floor. And the seam between those 2 worlds. The person who stood with 1 foot in each was Dr. Vivienne Roche. I should tell you what she was, because the resident's nickname makes her sound like a temperature, and she was not a temperature. She was a weather system. She had come up through the institute from the bottom, a scholarship girl, which nobody mentioned and everybody knew, an alpha from no family at all, who had walked into the most family-bound institution in the city at 22, and made herself indispensable, one impossible operation at a time, until the families who owned the place could not afford to be the ones who let her go elsewhere. By 30, she had the trauma service. By 35, she had the surgical board. By 38, she had the thing the families had spent 200 years refusing to give anyone who was not born to it, which was the chair of the operating committee, the actual control of the actual knives. And she had it not because they liked her. They did not like her, but because the Vesalius without Vivienne Roche was a marble building full of dead patients, and the Vesalius with her was the best surgical hospital in the country, and the families could count. Her scent was cold iron and bergamot. I knew that before I knew anything else about her, the way the whole floor knew it, because an alpha that controlled cannot fully suppress. And when Dr. Roche walked the trauma floor at 3 in the morning, the cold iron note came 2 seconds ahead of her, like the cold that comes off a window before you touch it. And the residents straightened and the chatter stopped. And the dying, I swear to you, sometimes the dying held on, because some animal part of a failing body hears an apex alpha enter the room and decides to wait and see. I had spent 3 years being weather to her. And then, on a Tuesday night in the wet middle of February, the city gave us the worst night of my career. And for 6 hours, I stopped being weather and became, without either of us deciding it out loud, the only pair of hands she trusted in the room. It came in as a collapse. A tram had jumped its rail on the icy hill above the river and gone into the front of a crowded cafe. And the ambulances came in a line, one after another, more than the night board had beds for, more than the night attendings had hands for. And the disaster protocol pulled every surgeon in the building down to the basement. And at the center of it, in the red light over Trauma Bay 2, was Dr. Roche. And at some point in the first hour, when the resident assigned to her bay actually froze, went gray and still over an open abdomen with his hand shaking, she looked up across the table and found the nearest competent person. And the nearest competent person was me. She did not know my name. She said, "You, hands," and I put my hands there. See, I have to tell you what those 5 hours were, because everything that came after was decided in them. And most people who tell a story like this skip the part where the two women actually meet, because the actual meeting is not romantic. The actual meeting is a man's torn body, and two people refusing to let it close. And yet that was the meeting. That was the whole of it, and I would not trade it for any ballroom. The man on the table was 44 years old. He'd been sitting at the window of the cafe with a coffee and a folded newspaper when 2 tons of tram came through the glass. And he had a flail chest and a torn diaphragm and a tear in the great vessel above his heart that should have emptied him onto the floor of Trauma Bay 2 in 90 seconds. And the only reason it did not was that Vivienne Roche got a gloved hand inside him and onto the tear and held it, physically held a man's aorta closed with 2 fingers for 5 hours, while the rest of us built around her hand the conditions in which he might be allowed to live. I had never seen anything like it. I have not seen anything like it since. She did not move for 5 hours. She did not eat. She did not sit. She did not raise her voice. She ran an entire resuscitation with one hand because the other hand was the only thing between that man and the floor, and she did it in a register so quiet that the room had to lean in to hear her, which is a thing the great ones do. They go quiet so that the room has to organize itself around them to listen. And I stood at her right side for 5 hours and became, without either of us choosing it, her other hand. She would say a number and I would have the drug. She would tilt her head a 1/4 inch, and I would have the clamp turn the way she needed it before she finished the tilt. Somewhere in the second hour, we stopped using words for the simple things. She would reach and I would fill the reach. She would look and I would already be moving. And the resident who had frozen stood against the wall and watched a chief of surgery and a night nurse she did not know run the most difficult 5 hours of trauma surgery he would ever witness in a near total silence that the team around us came to treat like weather, like a pressure system you do not speak inside of. That is what it is to find your hands match. I did not know that was what was happening. I thought I was just doing my job very well on a very bad night. I know now that what was happening was the rarest thing in my profession. The thing you can work 30 years and never once feel, which is the moment two people discover that their hands think the same thoughts and that it was happening to me beside the most powerful and most walled alpha in the building, and that her body knew what mine did not, and that somewhere in the second hour, in the red dark, while I held a clamp and thought about a torn aorta, she leaned in to adjust her own grip, and her masked mouth passed the joint of my neck and my shoulder, and something in her that had been locked since she was 19 reached out, in one breath, and did the oldest thing there is, and I felt only what I told myself was the graze of her mask. And the man lived, and I went home with a bruise. And at 4 in the morning, with the man finally stable and the worst of the night breaking, she looked at me over our masks across the quiet that comes after, and she asked me the question. It was not really a question about scheduling. I knew that even then. An attending does not look at a night nurse the way she was looking at me, like a problem she had just realized she had been misfiling for 3 years, and ask about a roster. She was asking the real question, the one underneath, which was, what are you doing hiding down here being this good in the dark? And I was tired. The specific, scoured, clean tired that comes after you have been the still point for 6 hours. The tired that takes the lid off, and I told her the truth. I said, because down here, nobody asks an Omega to be anything but useful. I watched it land. She had not smelled it on me. The suppressants had held all night, even through the heat and the blood and the fear. And so I had handed it to her on purpose, the one fact I had spent 3 years hiding. And I did not entirely know why I had done it, except that her cold iron scent had been 2 feet from me for 6 hours, and some part of me, the part my mother had spent 19 years trying to drown, had wanted, for once in my life, to be looked at by the most powerful person in the room, and not flinch. She looked at me, and she reached across the small space between us, and she moved the collar of my scrub top half an inch to the side, where it had pulled loose in 6 hours of work. And she looked at the joint of my neck and my shoulder for 1 second, 2, the way you look at something you are deciding about. And then the trauma line rang again, a new one, a stabbing under the bridge. And the night took us both back. And I did not think about the half-inch of collar again. I went home at 8 in the morning. I slept. I had a bruise on my neck when I woke, a small deep ache at the base of it. And I thought, 6 hours bent over a table, of course I have a bruise. I have bruises I can't account for after every bad night. And I put a high collar on for my next shift out of a vanity I did not examine. And I did not examine the ache. And I did not examine the fact that for 4 months afterward, the ache did not fade the way a bruise fades, but settled instead into something warm, something that woke up faintly every single time the cold iron and bergamot scent crossed the trauma floor at 3 in the morning. I told myself I imagined that too. I am a very good nurse. I am, it turns out, a catastrophically stupid Omega. The two things lived side by side in me for 4 months, and the night they finally collided, they collided in front of the entire surgical floor of the Vesalius Institute. You have to understand what a bond mark is, for the Omegas listening who know, and the everyone else listening who has only heard. It is not a bite. The films make it a bite, and it is not a bite. Acclaimed Omega smells, to any alpha who comes close, like a door with a name already on it. It is the oldest and most serious thing one of us can do to one of us. It is not done in trauma bays at 4 in the morning. It is not done to night nurses whose names you read off a badge. It is not done, above all, without the Omega knowing, except that an Omega on strong suppressants, an Omega who has spent 3 years flattening her own scent to nothing, an Omega who has trained herself out of reading her own body the way my mother trained me out of reading my own body. An Omega like that can carry a claim for 4 months and call it a bruise. Dr. Roche knew what she had done. I am sure of that now. She knew at 4 in the morning when she moved my collar and looked at the mark she had put there in the 2nd hour of the worst night of both our lives, put there without my noticing, in the red dark, with her mouth at my neck for the 3 seconds it takes while I was holding a clamp and thinking about a man's torn aorta and feeling only what I told myself was the graze of her mask. She had done the most serious thing an alpha can do to an Omega, to a stranger, in the middle of a disaster. And then she had stood up and the trauma line had rung, and she had spent 4 months doing what the frost surgeon does, which is control, which is wait, which is say nothing and let no one see the thing moving underneath, while the Omega she had claimed walked the night floor in a high collar 3 feet from her twice a week, and did not know she belonged, in the oldest grammar there is, to the most powerful alpha in the building. It would have gone on. I think it would have gone on for a year. Vivienne Roche is the most disciplined person I have ever met, and she had decided, in the way she decided everything, that she had made a catastrophic, unprofessional error in a moment of weakness, and that the correct response was to never act on it, never speak of it, and let the night nurse live the rest of her life never knowing. She is, in this one respect, exactly as stupid as I am. Because acclaimed Omega's body knows, even when her mind refuses to. And acclaimed Omega cannot take suppressants forever without her body, eventually going to war with the chemistry holding it flat. And on a Thursday in June, after a stretch of 4 double shifts in 5 days because the floor was short and I was the one who never said no, my body went to war with the suppressants and the claim and the exhaustion all at once, and it chose the worst possible place and the worst possible hour to do it. It chose the morning handover on the trauma floor, in front of the day surgical team, the night team, 2/3 of the residents, the charge nurses, and, because she had come down to review a case from the night, Dr. Vivienne Roche. I had been on for 30 hours. I want to be clear that this was not unusual, and that this is its own quiet horror, that a 30-hour stretch for a short-staffed trauma nurse was a Tuesday, that I had done it dozens of times, but I had not done it claimed, and I had not done it with my body 4 months into a slow rebellion I had refused to notice, and somewhere around the 28th hour, the floor had started to tilt at the edges, and the cold iron scent, when Dr. Roche came down at 7:40 in the morning, had hit me, not the way it had hit me for 4 months, a far warm ache, but like a hand closing around the back of my neck, like heat, like the first real heat I had never fully had, breaking through 3 years of suppressants and 4 months of denial in the fluorescent light of the morning handover with 31 people watching. I went down at the nurse's station. I remember the laminate of the counter coming up to meet the side of my face. I remember the sound the floor makes when a body hits it, which I had heard 1,000 times from the standing side and never once from the floor. And then the gray took me, and the next thing I knew I was looking up at a ceiling I did not recognize, a quiet ceiling, a private ceiling, and the cold iron and bergamot scent was everywhere, steady, close, and there was a weight on the edge of the bed where someone was sitting, and I turned my head. And doctor, I was in the private ward. I knew it the way you know things, before you've worked out how you know them. The quiet, the single bed, the real curtains, the door that closed all the way. The Vesalius has a private ward on the 6th floor, 6 rooms, for the patients whose families have names cut into the lobby floor. And night nurses do not go to the 6th floor. Night nurses do not have occasion to know what the 6th floor smells like. And I was in it, in a gown that was not mine, with a line in the back of my hand and a monitor making its small green sound. And Dr. Roche sitting on the edge of my bed I turned to find the clock, 11 in the morning, 3 hours after I had gone down, 3 hours into a day on which I happened to know, because the whole floor knew her schedule the way sailors know weather. She was meant to be doing a full list of elective operations that had been booked for months. I said the first thing the trained part of me reached for, which was the patient's question, the deflection, the keeping small. I said, "I'm sorry, I fainted. I'm fine. There's a stab coming in it. I should be." "Stop," she said. Not unkindly. "Wilder." I stopped. She looked at me for a moment, and then she told me what she had done. She told me about the 2nd hour of the tram night. She told me plainly, without softening it, in the flat exact voice she used for the worst news to the worst off families. Because she had decided, I learned later this was the most Vivienne Roche thing about the entire affair, that having done a serious thing to me without my knowledge, the one repair available to her was to never again let me not know a single thing. She told me she had claimed me. She told me she did not have a good account of why, only a true one, which was that she had spent 3 years half aware of a night nurse who slowed rooms down, and that night she had been inside the same dying man as me for 5 hours, and had looked up and found me steady in the red light. And something in her, something she had spent her whole scholarship girl life keeping in a locked drawer, had simply reached out in the 2nd hour, in a breath, at my neck, while I held a clamp, and done the oldest thing there is, and that she had known it was unforgivable in the same second she did it, and had stood up and said nothing, and spent 4 months calling it the worst mistake of her career, and intending to take it to her grave. "And then you went down on my floor," she said, "with my mark on your neck and your scent in the air, in front of 30 people, And a junior resident reached out to help you the way you help, by hand, by touch. And I had to put my body between you and him and say, don't touch her. In front of the entire surgical service, because acclaimed omega in heat being touched by an unbonded alpha is how people die, Wilder. And here, for the first and only time in the entire telling, her voice moved. Now, I have done it twice. Once in the dark where no one saw, and once in the light where everyone did. And you still don't have the first idea what I'm talking about, do you? And she moved the collar of the gown half an inch, the same half inch, with the same 2 fingers. And this time she held a small mirror up with her other hands that I could see, for the first time, the thing I had carried for 4 months at the base of my own neck. Not a bruise, not fading, deep and warm and unmistakably what it was. A claim, her claim, 4 months old and as fresh as the hour she'd made it. I looked at it in the mirror for a long time. The monitor made its small green sound. And then I started, helplessly, to laugh. The terrible, exhausted laugh of a person who has just understood that the central fact of the last 4 months of her life was visible in any mirror she cared to look in, and she had simply refused to look. And the laugh turned, the way that laugh always turns. And Dr. Vivienne Roche, chief of surgery, the frost surgeon, who did not touch and did not soften and did not stay, sat on the edge of a 6th floor bed with her watch off, and her list canceled and let a night nurse cry, and did not once tell me to hold still. She kept me in the private ward for 10 days. She had the authority to do it, and she used it without apology. The official record said omega nurse syncope and stress-related endocrine crisis, admitted for observation. And for observation is the phrase that did all the work. The phrase that let the chief of surgery move a night nurse to the 6th floor and post a do not disturb and come at the end of every operating day and sit on the edge of the bed. Because acclaimed omega coming through a first full heat that has broken through years of suppression cannot be left among unbonded alphas and cannot be sent home alone and can, in the oldest and least medical grammar there is, only really be steadied by the alpha, whose name is written into her scent. The hospital knew. The whole hospital knew by the 2nd day. 30 people had heard don't touch her. The story went up through the building like heat up a stairwell. I lay in the private ward and listened, through the door that closed all the way, to the institution rearrange itself around the thing that had happened on its trauma floor. And I learned, in those 10 days, more about Vivienne Roche than I had learned in 3 years of being her weather, because she came every evening, and she had decided to never again let me not know a thing. And so she told me. She told me about the scholarship. She told me about the families who owned the building, and the brass names in the floor, and the 40 years it had taken an alpha from a town like mine to be allowed to hold the actual knives. She told me about the operating committee and the 2 attendings who had voted against her chairmanship, and were still, 3 years later, waiting for her to fall. She told me, this on the 4th night, with the watch off on the cabinet, which I came to understand was the signal. The watch coming off meant she had stopped being the chief and started being the woman. About the thing she had never told anyone in the building, which was that she had grown up the omega-presenting child of an omega mother in a hard place, and had been told her whole childhood that she was an omega, that her body would be soft and small and quiet and useful, and had not presented as an alpha until she was nearly 20, late, furious, a whole stolen adolescence late, and had walked into the Vesalius the next year, having decided that she would be the apex of every room she entered for the rest of her life, precisely because she had spent 20 years being told she would be the floor of every room, and that the locked drawer she kept the rest of herself in had been locked since she was 19, and that she had not opened it for anyone, ever, until she had looked up across a dying man, and found a night nurse being the still point of a screaming room exactly the way she, Vivienne, had taught herself to be, and had recognized me. Those were her words. The 4th night, the watch off. I recognized you, Wilder. You're doing the thing I did. You took the only safe shape they offered you, and you got so good at it that no one ever made you be anything else. I have spent 4 months furious at myself, and somewhere in the 3rd month, I understood that I wasn't furious that I'd marked a stranger. I told her things too. I told her about the mill town and the office cleaning and my 2 brothers, both of them grown now, both of them out, the younger one a teacher and the older one a long-haul driver like the father neither of them remembered, and how I had gotten them out and then kept right on being the pair of hands that never said no because there was no one left to get out, and I had not, in 19 years of being useful, ever once worked out what I would do with a life that was only mine. I told her about the suppressants and the loose scrubs and the high collars and the 3 years of being weather. I told her, on the 7th night, with her watch off and the green monitor sound between us and the cold iron scent gone soft and close in the dark room, the thing I had never said to anyone, which was that when she had said hold still over the man's open chest 4 months before, some part of me that had been holding still my entire life had, for the first time, held still on purpose, for someone, instead of out of fear, and had liked it, and had been ashamed of liking it, and had carried the shame for 4 months alongside the mark, and called them both bruises. She was very quiet after that. Then she said, "You don't have to be ashamed of being still. You have to be ashamed of being still for people who haven't earned it. I haven't earned it." There were nights in between the talking that I should describe, because the talking makes it sound like we lay in a quiet room and exchanged childhoods, and some nights were not quiet. A first full heat breaking through years of suppression is not a thing that politely waits for the conversation to finish. There were hours, on the 3rd night and the 5th, when my body did the thing it had never been allowed to do, when the honey and green stem scent rose off me so loud it filled the 6th floor corridor, and the cold iron scent answered it from 2 feet away, whether either of us willed it or not, and Vivienne Roche sat in the chair by the bed, not on the bed, in the chair. She had moved to the chair the moment my body began to turn, putting the distance there on purpose, with her hands flat on her own knees and her jaw set like a woman holding an aorta closed, and wrote it out with me. That is the courtship. People want the courtship to be the grand gesture. The courtship was a woman not crossing a room. And on the morning after the 5th night, when the heat had broken, and I was wrung out and ashamed and could not look at her, she did the one thing that undid me completely. She got up from the chair, stiff from a night of sitting, and she went out, and she came back 20 minutes later with 2 coffees from the only decent place 2 streets away. She had left the building in the gray dawn, in her coat over her scrubs, to get an Omega who was not even properly her patient, a coffee that did not taste like the hospital. And she set one on the cabinet by my hand, and she said, not looking at me, giving me the gift of not looking at me, "Drink that. It's the only decent coffee in the quarter. When you're well, I'll take you to the actual place." Wham! And I understood that she was, in the only language she had, the language of a woman who had never once been allowed to want anything, asking me on a date from the chair beside a hospital bed, and I drank the coffee, and it was the best thing I had ever tasted, and neither of us said anything else about it. And that was the 5th night, and she did not touch me. She had not touched me, not once in 7 days, beyond the half-inch of collar and the clinical things. She was the most disciplined person I have ever met, and she had decided that a claim made in ignorance would not be consummated in a hospital bed by an alpha with power over the Omega's job. And she held that line for 10 days with a control that I understand now was its own kind of courtship, the only kind either of us would ever have trusted. And she said on the 7th night, the line I have kept. "When you are well, and out of this building, and not my patient and not afraid, if you still want to be still for me then, you'll tell me. And you'll say it like you mean to keep it. Not like an Omega saying of course, like a woman choosing. I have spent my whole life refusing to be the floor of anyone's room, Wilder. It would be a cleaner story if the only obstacle had been the two of us and our matching ruined childhoods. It was not. There was the building. The two attendings who had voted against her chairmanship were named Dr. Theo Vance and Dr. Margot Stare, and they had spent 3 years waiting. And a chief of surgery who cancels a full elective list to sit at the bedside of a night nurse she has bond claimed on the trauma floor in front of 30 witnesses, is not a person who has fallen, exactly, but she is a person who has handed her enemies a knife. By the 3rd day there was a complaint. It was filed by Stare, dressed in the language of patient safety and professional boundaries and the power differential between the chief of surgery and a junior nurse. And the terrible thing, the thing that kept me awake on the 4th and 5th nights, was that the language was not wrong. There was a power differential. She did have authority over my job. An alpha had put a claim on an omega who could not, in the structure of that building, freely say no to her. Stare's complaint was a weapon, and it was also, in its cold way, true. And I lay in the private ward and understood that the very thing that made Vivienne careful, the watch coming off, the line she would not cross, the "you'll say it like a woman choosing," was the thing the complaint could not see and would never credit, and that from the outside, in the language of committees, what had happened to me was exactly the thing the rules existed to prevent. I should tell you about Margot Stare, because a story is only as honest as it is about the person who tried to end it. And the easy version of Stare is the jealous rival, and the true version is more uncomfortable than that. Stare was a good surgeon, not a great one, a good one. Good enough to know, with the particular bitterness of the genuinely competent who will never be exceptional, exactly how far short of Vivienne Roche she fell, and to have built her whole professional identity around being the one who followed the rules Vivienne broke. She had wanted the chairmanship, and had lost it to a scholarship girl from a town like mine. And she had spent 3 years being correct about everything as a kind of revenge. And when Vivienne handed her the gift of a bond claim on a junior nurse, Stare did not gloat. That is the thing I learned, lying in the private ward listening to the complaint move through the building. She did not gloat. She filed a complaint that was, in its language, genuinely concerned with the thing the rules exist to protect, the thing that is real, the power an alpha attending holds over an omega nurse, and she believed she was protecting me. And the unbearable part, the part I have had to make my peace with, is that in a different version of this story, a version where Vivienne had crossed the room on the 3rd night, where she had used the for observation to take instead of to shelter, where she was the alpha the rules imagine when they write the rules, Margot Stare would have been the only person in the building doing the right thing. The rules are not stupid because they imagine that alpha. That alpha exists. The rules are stupid because they cannot tell that alpha apart from the one sitting in a chair 3 feet from a heat with her hands flat on her knees. And they were never built to. And a system that cannot tell the difference between taking and sheltering will, every time, when it is forced to choose, protect itself by punishing the shelter. Because the shelter is the harder thing to see. The matter went, as these matters did at the Vesalius, to the chair of the board. The chair of the board was Professor Ingrid Vane, who was 73, an alpha, the last living member of one of the founding families, the only person in the building Vivienne Roche answered to, and the only person who had voted for her chairmanship without being asked twice. Professor Vane had run the board of the Vesalius for 16 years, and had buried 2 husbands and 1 son and most of her own generation. And she had a way of sitting very still and letting other people fill silences until they had said the thing they had come in determined not to say. And she had used it to settle every serious dispute in the building for a decade and a half. And she had read Margot Stare's complaint, I learned later, exactly once, and had then set it face down on her desk and said to her secretary the single sentence that decided my life, "Tell Vivienne I'll see the nurse." Alone. Professor Vane came to the private ward on the 8th day. She came alone. She sent Vivienne out. "I'll speak to the nurse by herself, Vivienne. Sit down somewhere and practice not controlling a room for 10 minutes. And she sat in the chair by my bed, small and upright and old the way old stone is old. And she looked at me for a while, and then she asked me one question, the only question. the question, the entire complaint, and the entire board and the entire 200-year institution came down to. She said, "Child, forget the marks and the heats and the chemistry, which I am too old to be impressed by. Tell me one thing, and tell me the true version. Because I have been listening to people lie to me in this building for 50 years, and you will not be the one who manages it." I did not keep small. I did not, for the first time in my life, reach for the answer that would make the powerful person's life easier. I thought about the watch coming off on the cabinet. I thought about 10 nights of a woman who had every power over me and used exactly none of it. And I told Professor Ingrid Vane the truth, which was the worst and the best thing, which was, it would be the worst thing that ever happened to me. Professor Vane looked at me for a long moment. Then she stood up, with the slowness of old stone moving, and she went to the door, and she opened it, and Vivienne was standing in the corridor, not pacing, standing, the way she stood at the foot of a table, but I could see even from the bed that the stillness cost her everything. And Professor Vane said, in the dry voice of a woman who has settled 50 years of disputes in this building and is tired of all of them, "The complaint is dismissed." Not because there was no power differential. There was. Stare is not wrong about the shape of it. And you, Vivienne, will spend the next year being grateful I am the one who holds this chair, and not someone who cares more about being correct than about being right. She paused at the door. "Take the mark or dissolve it between the two of you, when she is well and out of here. But decide it as two people, not as a chief and a nurse. And Vivienne," and here the old alpha's dry voice did something almost gentle, "the drawer you keep yourself in. I have watched you keep it locked for 16 years. And she left, and Vivienne came into the room and stood at the foot of the bed where the watch was off on the cabinet, and neither of us said anything for a long time. And then I said, because someone had to be the one to choose, and I had spent my whole life letting other people choose, and I was done. I said, "Bring me my own clothes. Discharge me. Get me out of this building and out of this gown and somewhere I am not your patient." There was a 9th night I have not told you about, and it is the one I think about most because it is the night I stopped being a person. Something was happening too, and became a person doing something. By the 9th night, the heat had long broken, and the complaint was dismissed, and I was medically ready to go home, and we both knew it. And we both knew that the next thing was the thing we had been not doing for 9 nights. And Vivienne came in at the end of the operating day and took her watch off on the cabinet and sat in the chair, not on the bed. And we sat in the quiet with the green monitor sound. And I understood that she was never going to be the one to start it. That was the whole architecture of her. She had done one ungoverned thing in her life, in the 2nd hour of the tram night, and it had nearly cost her everything. And she had concluded, wrongly, but with the whole force of her disciplined heart, that the lesson was never again, that she would offer and offer and offer and never once reach, that she would hold the door open her entire life and make the other person walk through it so that no one could ever again say that Vivienne Roche had taken something. And that meant that if I waited for her to cross the room, I would wait until we were both old, that she had built herself deliberately into a woman who could not take the last step, and that the last step was therefore and would always be mine. So I took it. Not all the way. Not in a hospital bed. We had both promised the old woman and ourselves that this would be decided as 2 free people outside the building, and we kept that. But I got up off the bed, on the 9th night, on legs that had not held a body's full weight in 9 days, and I crossed the 3 feet she would not cross. And I stood in front of the chair where the most powerful alpha in the building sat, with her hands flat on her knees and her watch off, and her whole body gone still as a held breath. And I put my hand, just my hand, flat against the side of her face, the way I put a hand against a frightened patient to slow a room down. Except that this was the opposite of slowing a room. This was a room starting. And I felt the cold iron scent go warm under my palm. And I felt her turn her face a half inch into my hand, the way I had turned my neck a half inch toward her mouth without knowing it 4 months before. And I said the only thing that needed saying on the 9th night, which was, I'm going to walk out of this building in the morning, and then I'm going to come find you. So don't you dare decide this is a mistake while I'm gone. You don't get to do the noble thing and disappear. I've spent 19 years letting people decide things about me by leaving. You're going to stay, and you're going to let me choose you in the daylight on a public street like a free woman. That's the deal. And Vivienne Roche, who had not been told what to do by anyone since she was 19 years old, looked up at the Omega standing over her with a hand against her face and nodded once, exactly once, the way she tilted her head a quarter inch over a table. And I felt the whole weather system of her agree to be still for me. And that was the 9th night. And it was the first wholly free thing I had ever done in my life. And I did it standing on legs that shook. And I have never once regretted it. She discharged me on the 10th day. She put her hands in her coat pockets. She said, "There's a place 2 streets from here that does the only decent coffee in this quarter. You're not my patient anymore. You're not in my building." And then she asked me again, the question under all the questions, the one she had been too disciplined to ask for 4 months, and too careful to ask for 10 days. And she asked it plainly. An apex alpha on a public step asking an omega for something instead of taking it. Do you want to be still for me, knowing everything you know? And I said it like I meant to keep it. I'm not going to tell you the exact words here, because some things you keep, and the words I said to Vivienne Roche on the steps of the Vesalius Institute on a cold, bright afternoon in June are mine and hers and not YouTube's. They were not the small, useful keeping quiet my mother spent 19 years teaching me. They were a free woman's words, said in the loud honey and green stem scent I no longer drown, on a public street, to an alpha who had spent 10 days refusing to be given anything I had not chosen to give. And I will tell you that she heard them, and that the cold iron scent went warm in a way I had only felt once before, in the dark of the private ward, and that she took one hand out of her coat pocket and held it out, palm up, in the middle of the public street, not reaching for me, not taking, just open, just there, and that I put my hand in it, and that we walked 2 streets to the only decent coffee in the quarter, and that the mark at the base of my neck, 4 months old, woke up warm and stayed warm and has stayed warm every day since. It is a year later now. I still work at the Vesalius. This surprises people who assume the omega in the story must have been spirited away to a soft life. I am a trauma nurse. I will be a trauma nurse until my hands give out. The still point of a screaming room is the truest thing I am, and I would not give it up for any alpha alive. And Vivienne, who recognized me precisely because I was that, and who would not want me if I stopped, has never once asked me to. I came off the heavy suppressants. I wear my own scent now. Honey and green stems and rain on hot stone. And the floor got used to it in about a week, the way floors get used to everything. And the residents who once called the chief the frost surgeon to her face now watch the cold iron scent and the honey scent cross paths at 3 a.m. on the trauma floor, and have the sense, mostly, to look at their charts. Dr. Theo Vance transferred to a hospital across the country in the autumn. Dr. Margot Sterry is still here, still waiting, and Vivienne treats her with a flawless professional courtesy that is its own form of frost, and that I, privately, enjoy more than is good for me. Professor Ingrid Vane retired from the chair in the spring. She came to the small thing we held, the not quite wedding the omegas in my family have, instead of weddings, the binding of 2 scents witnessed by the people who matter. And she sat in the front in her old stone stillness. And afterward, she took my hand in both of her dry old hands and said, "I asked you the worst or best question, child, and you answered it like a free woman. And that is the only thing I have ever cared about in this building. Be free in it." She died in the summer. Vivienne, who does not cry, did not cry, and then came home and took her watch off on the cabinet and sat on the edge of our bed and let me be the still point of the only screaming room that has ever been allowed inside her. And I held her, and I understood that this is the other half of the thing, that hold still goes both ways, that an alpha who has spent her whole life being the apex of every room needs sometimes, in the dark, with the watch off, to be the one who is held, and that I, who spent 19 years being told my stillness was the price of my safety, get to spend the rest of my life being still for someone on purpose, by choice as a free woman, because she asked instead of telling me every single time, even now, even a year in, even when she does not have to. The watch is on the cabinet on my side of the bed now. She gave it to me on the night of the binding. I do. It means she has stopped counting the time. It means the chief has gone and the woman has stayed. It means hold still, I'm not finished looking at you, which is the thing she said to me on the third night of the private ward and the thing she says to me still, and which I have learned, finally, at 26, is not a command an alpha gives an omega. It is a promise. And we keep it. I found out the bruise on my neck was not a bruise on a Thursday in June, in front of the entire surgical floor of the Vesalius Institute. And it was the worst and the best thing that ever happened to me, and I would not undo a single second of the 4 stupid months I called it a bruise, because they were the 4 months an apex alpha spent quietly furious at herself for wanting a woman she thought she had stolen, when all along the woman had been down on the night floor 3 feet away twice a week, in a high collar, waiting to be asked to be still on purpose, for the first time in her life, by someone who would never, ever make her the floor of the room. Her name is Vivienne Roche. My name is Noa Wilder. The mark is hers. The choosing was mine. The watch is on the cabinet, face up, and neither of us is counting the time. If you stayed to the end of this one, thank you. These stories take a long time to tell the right way, and you gave me an hour, and I know what an hour is worth. If you want the parts I could not tell here, the private ward at night, the thing said with the watch off, the uncensored version, it is on the Patreon, link in the description. Tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe so the next woman's story finds you. And be still when you find someone who asks instead of tells. Only then, but then, let yourself.